By this point, you've probably heard that more and more Americans are riding bikes.
Bike sales are surging.
The bike industry said that sales in May were up 81%. That's the second consecutive month that sales have topped $1 billion.
People have been scrambling to buy bicycles, causing major shortages.
During the pandemic, some cities closed their streets to give bikers and pedestrians more room to maintain a social distance. In the spring and summer of 2020, bike shops struggled to meet the surging demand from new cyclists. Since then, retailers have been able to get their inventories in shape. With more bikes, motorcycles, mopeds, and scooters on the road, transportation experts say the moment is prime for a transit upheaval. All of this combined is called micromobility. Here's how having more bikes on the road could change the U.S. transportation system. There are two groups of people who have picked up biking during the pandemic: those who use it to commute to work or get around, and those who use it for fitness and recreational purposes. Shannon Un falls into the first bucket. She signed up for a City Bike membership in New York City this September.
Using the bike for me right now is basically just getting myself from one place to another. I was not biking before the pandemic just because biking in New York City is so scary and cars are just all over the place, and I just avoided bikes at all costs. But now the reason why I changed is because that there's lesser cars and I just feel much safer on a bike.
Shannon also represents the growing number of women in the traditionally male-dominated activity. In New York, women are now the biggest users of the city's bike share program since it launched in 2013.
A big reason behind that gender difference is that fear and concerns about traffic safety, in addition to personal safety, but primarily traffic safety. And so in this environment where there's less motor vehicle traffic, it certainly has the potential for getting more women out there riding.
Cypress Kolar lives in North Carolina. He wasn't biking before the pandemic, but now he bikes around 7 hours a week.
During the pandemic, the gyms closed. And so I bought some weights, but I was getting a lot of cardio from basketball and was, I guess, looking for another way to get some exercise. I might just race for one season and that might fall off, but I think cycling just for fun and just for exercise is something I might hold on to.
Cypress was lucky. He scored a road bike by looking on Facebook Marketplace, but not everyone has been as fortunate. Early on in the pandemic, basic-level adult bicycles under $200 led bike sales, soaring more than 203% from the year prior. Sales of mountain bikes increased by more than 150%, and children bikes grew by 107%. Then, in June 2020, the demand shifted to higher-end bicycles worth more than $1,000, like road, mountain, and electric bikes. Before the pandemic, high-end electric bike company VanMoof tripled its production in anticipation of growth, but that wasn't enough.
COVID changed a lot for us as a company. It caused a lot of more demand. Demand is much higher than production at the moment. To give you an idea, I think in Q2 2020, we had 6 times more demand than in 2019.
We've worked harder than we've ever worked in our lives, just trying to keep up with things. And our Specialized has been around almost 50 years. So it's not like there's no bikes. It just depends on which bike you want.
The biking infrastructure in the United States lags behind European nations and other countries where cycling is already integrated into their transportation systems. And for one big reason. In the US, cars are king.
It's still the most common transportation mode, and actually this is also very much an impact of federal funding and federal policies. Up to 1991, almost all federal funding was going towards the building of highways, towards the car and a bit public transit. It's the first time in 1991 that we see some dollars that is allocated to active means of transportation, improvements for cycling and biking. Since then, we have witnessed more funding, which has some impact in terms of, building an infrastructure that is safer for cyclists.
Some cities already had the funding and plans in place to launch an expansion of their biking network ahead of the pandemic. They were able to act quickly when they saw a rise in cycling interest. Seattle was one of those cities. It also was one of the first municipalities to announce it was making 20 of its 25-mile Stay Healthy Streets program permanent, a program meant to allow residents outside while maintaining a social distance.
Really early on in the pandemic, we made a decision to repurpose some of our neighborhood streets, our neighborhood greenways, as we call them, to be local access only and to make them closed for cars going through and open for people walking and people biking. This allowed people to socially distance and also get to key destinations. And we found really quickly that more people were walking and biking on those streets, and we decided to make them permanent. And now we're working with communities as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic to figure out what exactly that means in terms of making those permanent.
Seattle isn't alone. Around the world, cities like Bogota and Berlin also expanded their biking infrastructure. Others like Milan, London, and Geneva have added flexible bike lanes to separate bikers and cars. In the US, some cities have seen a gradual recovery in rides on shared bicycles and scooters as a result of temporary cycling infrastructure.
But one of the things we are starting to see in the data is that the trips are actually growing in length, which I think is a really interesting finding, is people are taking longer trips with shared micromobility post-pandemic. And I think that may be closely aligned with a growth in infrastructure to support it, like slow streets.
The biking infrastructure in the US can range from a parking protected bike lane, protected bike lanes, bicycle boulevards, off-street trails and paths, traffic-cone streets, and traditional striped bike lanes.
Those elements, in addition to things like bike traffic signals, we have all of those tools, and they just need to be combined in the right context, in the right environment. And usually what we find, or what I would argue, is that the biggest barrier is more political will to make those improvements. I think we know how to build those types of networks. We just aren't always willing to do it.
In March 2020, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University looked at 6 cities and compared the sales, wages, employment numbers of the retail and food services before and after the cities added biking infrastructure to those areas. The study was built on a 2013 New York City Department of Transportation and a 2014 San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency survey.
So we have found that in a number of places, new bike lanes, new pedestrian infrastructure in business areas can often is associated with increased sales, increased employment to businesses along those corridors. So in some cases, there's no effect, but rarely have we seen a negative effect.
Funding remains a big challenge for biking infrastructure. The money for bicycle infrastructure traditionally comes from federal and state gas taxes. Most of the money ends up going toward automobile infrastructure. Opponents argue that since it comes from gas taxes, the money should be used on improving infrastructure for motor vehicles, not bikes. Once funding is secured, the next step is determining where to place the infrastructure. That placement can often cut along class and racial lines.
Currently, up until now, when we look across cities in the U.S., bicycle infrastructure is usually not equitably distributed. And so there's some good research out there that shows, at least in larger cities, white and higher income people are probably going to have better access to bicycle infrastructure. So that certainly has to change. We need to do a much better job of being more equitable in providing accessible, safe infrastructure for everyone.
Even though more Americans are biking during the pandemic, it's not clear biking will maintain the popularity once it's over. When the U.S. reopened from COVID lockdowns during the summer months, transportation planners carefully watched a metric known as the vehicle miles traveled. It measures the amount of travel for all vehicles in an area over a period of time. That metric fell in March 2020. The number increased when cities reopened from COVID lockdowns, indicating that people were taking longer rides in their cars and a possible return to congested roads. Car traffic levels have not returned completely to pre-pandemic levels. For cities that have already prioritized shared micromobility and pedestrian pathways, biking will continue to grow as a permanent transportation option.
One of the silver linings that we're seeing is an increased appetite for cycling and scooter use and walking. So one of the things we're predicting is that we're going to see more infrastructure dedicated to safe walking and cycling and scooter use moving forward, and people taking advantage of active transportation as a mode.
So as we look at where we're making those infrastructure investments, a lot of it is based on where the streets themselves need the investment, and where we need to rebuild streets or repave streets, and when we do that, what we can do in terms of making those streets into supporting multimodal travel. As we recover from the pandemic and people need to move again, we're going to need to make sure that people have all sorts of travel options, so we don't get back to congestion and frustration with our transportation system, and we can make sure that people can get around the city safely, no matter how they choose to do so.